Sweet. So first, if we could give Brian another round of applause, because this has been awesome. Thank you. This is my old stomping ground. So I live in California now, but I used to live in Boston. And so when Brian asked me if I'd come out and speak at World IAA Boston, I was like, oh yeah, man, come back to my my hometown. So that being said, I've been out in California for about 5 years now. I do not miss the cold weather that you guys have out here. Whew, man. But I am very, very pleased to be out here. So, let's see if this thing works. Sweet. All right. So I'm gonna start by telling you guys a story. I think it was the summer of probably '78, and I was sitting in my grandfather's workshop on a four-legged stool with a green vinyl top. You guys seen those like from the '70s? You know what I'm talking about, right? And I remember sitting on this stool in his wood shop. I was probably about 6 years old at the time, and it was in the summer in Indiana, by the way. If anybody has been to Indiana, but Indiana summers, hot, humid. But I remember sitting on this stool in his workshop and watching him go over and pick up an 8-quarter, 3-foot piece of cherry. Now, for those who don't do any woodworking or furniture building, because I build furniture on the side, 8-quarter is just a fancy term for 2-inch thick. But if you build furniture, you don't say, I'm going to go get a 2x4. You say, I'm going to get an 8-quarter piece of wood. If you go to a lumber yard and ask for a 2x4, they laugh at you. They're like, you must not really know what you're doing. So, but he picked up this raw piece of lumber, and he loved working this cherry. He built probably 70% of the furniture in their house. And he wasn't actually a woodworker by trade. He sold insurance for a living. But woodworking was kind of his passion, his love. And it was the craft that he was kind of into. So I remember as a child, sitting on this workshop, he takes this 8-quarter piece of 3-foot raw cherry, and he throws it into a lathe, and he turns the lathe on. I distinctly remember this, like the sound of the lathe just spinning up and starting to kind of, and watching as he just went to work on this piece of wood. And remember distinctly like the smell of fresh cut cherry with Swisher Sweet cigar smoke. He loves smoking Swisher Sweets. Just kind of blending in the air, and then colliding with the distinct smell of Mr. Clean, because he always kept a bucket of Mr. Clean in the back corner of his shop, right? So you got these nice aromatics with this kind of pungent Mr. Green Clean kind of getting mixed in the air. And I just remember, watching him as a child take that piece of just a block of wood and turn out this beautiful, elegant, duck-footed table leg, which is actually like one of the hardest things to do. I didn't know that at 6. I just thought it was like really cool. And just being impressed with what this guy could do with his own 2 hands, right? Like take something kind of raw, and then a little later he's got this functional leg that actually does something, and it's actually like really beautiful to look at. So that's the wrong way. As a child, that's a memory that really, really stuck with me. This is my grandfather on the left. He's a pretty sharp dresser. And was always a man of style and substance. Incidentally, the woman standing to his left was my grandmother. And it's a funny story, their first date, he told her, her name was Evelyn, he said, Evelyn, I don't ever date a woman more than once. And she said, okay. That was the last date that he went on. So she took care of that. So anyway, these memories of me sitting in my grandfather's wood shop really fond memories. I don't have a whole lot of memories as a kid, but these are very, very distinct. And I think, honestly, they have a lot to do with defining who I am today. The sense of craft is something that's really important to me. I'm going to speak about that today, just the impact it's had on my life. In addition to my grandfather, has been a huge inspiration for me. There are other men and women in my life that I've come across that have been an inspiration. Charles and Ray Ames. I think Dan mentioned Ames earlier today. And as Dan mentioned, he was actually an architect by trade, not a furniture designer. But the Ames, actually, they were this really fabulous partnership that kind of brought industrialized mid-century modern furniture to the masses. At a time, they kind of cut their teeth at a time when the craftsmanship movement was coming into existence in America. And what's interesting about them is they went down the path of mass production, which a lot of people in the craft movement were adamantly against. But they found a way actually to kind of embrace it and do kind of mass production for this age, but at a really high quality. I happen to have a couple 1972 old Ames bucket chairs in my house that are still beautiful, great to look at, comfortable to sit in, and they're 40 years old plus at this point. So another person that kind of influenced me over the years is Joseph Eichler, kind of the godfather of mid-century modern residential architecture. I happen to live in an Eichler. I consider myself very blessed to live in an Eichler in Northern California. I don't live in this Eichler, but I've got some Ames furniture in my Eichler house, which is pretty awesome. What a lot of people don't know about Eichler is that he was actually not an architect. Most people think that he was an architect. Joseph Eichler was not an architect. He was a developer. He was just smart enough that back in the 50s and 60s to hook up with half a dozen architects that he could share his vision with, and then they could basically turn his vision into these fabulous mid-century modern designs. Most of his homes were built in the 50s and 60s. Mine was built in 56. It's actually in the largest Eichler community that I'm aware of. It's in San Mateo. It's called the Highlands. There's like 600 up there. If you're a fan of Eichlers and you get out there, like when I came across this neighborhood and drove in, I was just like, oh my, like the clouds open, angels started singing. I was like, oh my God, this is amazing, because they're all in pretty phenomenal condition. So, but Eichler is also someone who inspires just my general thoughts about the work that I do. Around the same time that Ames and Eichler were kind of making their foray, this gentleman, Sam Maloof, and his wife Frida, kind of came, let's say, like onto the market. They kind of came into the field a bit. The interesting story about Sam. He was also a classically trained architect, and Sam is very, very bold about this. If you ever get a chance to kind of watch some of the videos about Sam Maloof, like he's not only passionate about building furniture, but his love for Frida is just inspiring. He's very honest about the fact that if it was not for his wife Frida, he never would have built furniture. If you're in the furniture industry, Sam Maloof is like beyond a god. He actually, there's a well-known joint that he made called the Maloof joint that's gorgeous and beautiful. What's interesting about it is that during the craftsman era that he kind of came into existence, most other furniture makers were trying to hide joinery. And Sam took the opposite approach. He actually embraced joinery and said that, like if you're going to have it, just make it beautiful. And I'd encourage you guys to go like just do a Google search for the Maloof joint, and I mean they are gorgeous, hard as hell to make. So I've actually learned how to make them now. They're not easy, right? But in the furniture kind of making field, when you learn to do a Maloof joint, like you know, you kind of finally arrived, right? But he embraced joinery, wanted to make it beautiful, and you know, his wife. It's interesting again, like, you know, she drove him to do it. He came home one day from his job as an architect and was kind of kicking around the idea of making furniture. And she just told him, she said, you should go quit your job and go make furniture. And he was like, but how are we gonna survive? She's like, we'll figure it out. And she ran his business. When she met him, he had a backlog of 3 years worth of work. And so she decided to start doubling the prices on his furniture to try and get down to a year. She continued to double the prices like every month on his furniture, and he maintained a 2-year backlog until the day he died. Yeah. He is beyond famous. This is a Maloof rocker. He has done rocking chairs for multiple presidents. Reagan, Carter, Bush Sr. At the time, right before he died, actually, his rockers were going at auction for $75,000 a piece. Yeah, you know, it's an amazing story. You know, these things are gorgeous, and I've not had the chance to sit in one yet. I will one day. But everyone who sits in one, what's amazing is like he only builds them out of hardwood, and just the care that he has taken to design these chairs. They're known as being like the most comfortable chair you can sit in, right? And what's really amazing about Sam when he did these chairs is he actually used his own body as the mold. And so you'll watch videos where one of the last pieces he made before he died is actually a reclined rocker. And you'll see him actually laying on the ground next to the template to make sure that the measurements actually kind of work out. And you know, I'm a 6 foot tall guy. He was maybe 5'8", 5'10". He was Lebanese, so not a particularly tall gentleman. But and he talks about how his chairs work for pretty much anybody of any size. And he's not like a man of large stature, but just the care that he took to it, and the way that he shaped the chairs around body proportions, even like the way the back is shaped, it's around natural curves of the body. You know, really, really fascinating. So another man who made his career change at some point in his life, who is also a huge source of inspiration for me, is Matthew Crawford. He wrote a book entitled Shop Class as Soulcraft. And prior to this career that Matthew now has in restoring vintage motorcycles, he worked on Wall Street as a trader. And in his book, Shop Class as Soulcraft, he goes into great detail about his career as a trader on Wall Street, having made many people billions and billions and billions of dollars and finding incredibly unsatisfying. And one day, literally just deciding, I'm going to quit my job. I think he's in Vermont now, maybe. I can move to Vermont, buy a little place, and just start working on vintage bikes. And he describes in that book how, and apparently he's really well known in like the vintage motorcycle community, but he describes how these big, burly, full bearded, musky men bring him their most cherished possession, like a 1920s Indian that's no longer running, and literally just hand it over to him and put a lot of faith in him to bring this thing back to life. And he goes to work on it, and he gets it running, and then he'll call them, and hey, your bike's ready, come to pick it up, and he says, this is a normal thing for him. His client will come back to pick the bike up, and they start it up for the first time in decades, and they're overwhelmed with tears of joy. He's like, what it's like to have like some big burly biker dude who's like 350 pounds, like just start hugging you and crying. He's like, this is so much more rewarding to me than all the billions I made all these people in my entire career on Wall Street, right? So I mean, all of these guys and women, so the men and women that are here that inspire me, I mean, they share a great sense of purpose, a strong desire to do something that's meaningful, right? And that has been a huge source of inspiration for me. This past year, I had the privilege, the delight, the honor to spend a weekend with this bearded crew down in Southern California. The gentleman in the overalls who's holding kids, his name is Jory Brigham, and he runs Jory Brigham Design, also a furniture maker. Jory's story is incredibly interesting. His grandfather was a draftsman for Frank Lloyd Wright. Jory's a third generation maker, craftsperson. And Jory actually was born in Hawaii, at a young age drowned. And I think, if I remember correctly, he was dead for like 20 minutes or something, right? They brought him back to life. He sustained some damage from the drowning, wasn't able to speak for a while. And he chose to pour himself into furniture making, like as a kid, right? That became his outlet and his therapy. And through furniture building, he actually learned to speak again and like did a full recovery, right? What's amazing about, I spent 3 days with these guys, and all way more skilled than I am at building furniture. Most of these guys are like 15 years in. I'm like on my 4th year, you know. So, and these guys knew way more about Jory's backstory than I did. But watching this guy work is incredible. Like he'll take a piece of wood and he sees stuff in that large piece of wood that, like, you know, you and I wouldn't see. And then he just starts to like sculpt and work away at this piece of wood. He doesn't use computers at all. All of his furniture is drawn out by hand at full scale. So one of the techniques that he uses is he'll literally just grab like a large sheet of MDF or plywood to make a template and just starts drawing full scale, right? So you can really kind of get a feel for how this thing is going to work. So it was a really awesome 3 days to see this guy work, to learn from him, to work alongside him, and then even better, to actually make this and get to take this thing home. So this is a table that I made with Jory about 2.5 days in his shop. It took about 20 hours. About 12 of those hours is sanding and finishing. And that front is actually coped on a table saw. So that sculpting that you see is actually done with a table saw. So really great time. It's honestly probably one of the most awesome weekends of my entire life, and I'd love to go back again. So I'm inspired by these people, just their sense of craftsmanship, their care, their commitment to their craft. It's something that my grandfather handed on to me. I'm hoping to pass it on to my children. In fact, I think that's happening. This is a piece that I designed and built for my sister, my oldest sister, for Christmas this year. My oldest son, who's 7, helped me pick out the wood. He helped me actually run some of the cuts on the table saw. He helped me do some of the assembly and the glue up and the joinery. Had a great time working with him on it. And then he actually wrote the Christmas card in his 7-year-old, like, sketchy, and attached it to the bottom. We had a great time doing it. The weekends when I go to build furniture, he oftentimes comes out and says, "Hey, Dad, can I do some? We're going to do saw work," and so he'll come out with me. This is, it's a legacy that's kind of passed on to me that I'm kind of hoping to pass on to my kids, and it's something I really kind of love and cherish. So. Being a father of 3, I think I was talking to Nate about this. I've got 3 kids. He's got 3 girls, right? Yeah. God love you, man. I got 1 girl. That's enough. But being the father of 3 kids, and I mean those of us that are parents, one of the things that I'm continually thinking about is the legacy I'm leaving behind, for my children, right? I was at a kind of a conference maybe 2 years ago, and there's a comment that one of the speakers made that has stayed with me since. it was kind of a question and a statement. He asked those of us that are parents if we are who we want our children to be. And then he followed it up with, because you are who your children will become. And as a parent, that hits me in the gut, right? And it really starts making you think about, like, wow, it's like the example I'm living day by day, is that the example I want them to lead, right? And I've been in this field for a really long time. Some of you know me most of it. So a few decades, let's put it that way. And most of that in some form of a leadership role. And so in a leadership role, I take that same approach to my leadership role. I ask myself on a daily basis, like, am I the example that I want my staff to be? Like, am I living the way that I want them to live? Am I setting the example in the office, out of the office, with how we interact with other people, right? The language that we use, whether we're tolerant or not tolerant of certain behaviors. And so that's kind of like, that's the model I try and live by, and and try and extend to my staff. So these are things that I think about it a lot. I think about it when I wake up in the morning, as I'm winding down for the evening, throughout the course of the day, just this notion of kind of legacy that I'm leaving behind. And the thing is that living a legacy or having this impact on others, you don't have to be in a leadership role to do it, right? I mean, I've got people on my staff that still, by their demeanor, their behavior, the words they use, the way they interact with others, they're still leaving a legacy and still leading for other in our company, right? Because we live in a design organization, and so we're often paired with product engineering and others. And so if I'm having a disagreement with a product manager, that way I interact with that person is the legacy that I look at as our org is like as a whole, right? So what I want to talk to you guys about now is a few things where I've started in the practice that I've got in the design field. Kind of where can you take this notion of a legacy and craftsmanship, and how do you apply that in the digital world, right? Because with furniture, it's easy to see that. But most of us are in the software field. I mean, I am, at least, right? So there's a couple, three things basically that I want to kind of unpack for you. So one of the areas where I try and apply this notion of a legacy and craftsmanship is in design systems. That's kind of an easy one, right? It's easy to kind of see how, if you're building a design system, where that would apply. In addition to design systems, a lot of my work lately has been focused on organizational design. So, where do we fit in the company? What does design mean in the company? Does it only live in the design department? Spoiler alert, it should be no. If it does, you're in trouble. So basically, design systems, organizational design, and design operations. So I'm going to start with talking about design systems. And this is probably one that I think most of you guys are most familiar with, or at least some level of familiarity. Right there it is. That's right here somewhere. So, and the thing about design systems, I mean, there's a bunch of them out now, right? I mean, we've all probably seen Google Material Design, maybe run into Salesforce's Lightning system. Intuit has Harmony. GE has Predix, right? And so there's some pretty standard things you do when you're building a design system. I've worked on, I don't even know how many at this point. The current company I'm at, Aptus, we're building a design system called Nova, which is kind of for enterprise stuff at Cisco. I led the efforts for Symphony. I worked on material design. I worked on a bunch, several before that. So, for me, these are kind of old hat. But, if you're working on a design system, or if your company's thinking about working on a design system, there's standard things you would have, like typography, color, buttons, inputs, several components, so on and so forth, right? But one of the things that's often overlooked is kind of how these things get deployed, and that gets into documentation, right? And material design's probably got some of the best documentation of any design system I have ever encountered, right? Little backstory, when I was doing some work on, I did some consulting at Google and was on a secret project that probably still won't launch for another year. But it was actually before material design was public. So internally, we called it quantum paper. And the idea behind it was, thinking about the interface more as paper and in the physical realm. And so that's where light and shadows and these things kind of came in. And the kind of flip point of view for material design from any previous system was if you push a button, it goes down. With material design, it actually lifts up to the glass. And so what you'll see on their behaviors is as you interact with items, they actually lift and the shadows increase, because as the light is coming at a certain direction, as it comes closer to light, the shadow gets cast lower. And these guys spent hours, days. Literally, they had like a whole photo booth and with like lighting, and they were taking cards and like, changing the distance to just think about like how shadow gets cast. I mean, it was an extensive study that most people look at and be like, oh my God, why do you waste so much time? But it's a really, really well-crafted system. One of the things, if you guys do work on a design system that you want to consider, is this basically it's a model for constructing the components and the elements. Get that to come off. All right. So, and this is a general model that most of us have done large-scale systems work off of. So if we take, like a card, for example, which is a pretty common thing in material design, right? You'll typically start with the reference design. And so you'll have a reference card design, and with that comes certain specs on padding, spacing, shadow, the border radius on the corner, and that type of thing, right? Then you typically run into variants. And so variants are, different iterations or riffs off of the original source. One of the best examples is a date picker. So you've got like the original version of the date picker, which is your reference design, and then if you're working on multiple applications, you probably need some variant because the one in the healthcare industry needs some certain things that the variant doesn't have, right? Then you end up with an experimentation layer, and in the experimentation layer, that's where your team kind of continues to explore new components, new ways of doing things, so on and so forth. And lastly, you end up with what we call one-offs. And the thing about one-offs are they're just that, they're one-offs. The reference designs and variants are typically captured in documentation. So, and you'll see, they're kind of going through different variants of cards here, right? Those are typically documented, and you want to encourage the use of those. The one-offs, you don't include the system, you don't ever document, you strongly discourage the use of, and you don't want anybody sharing this stuff out, right? So this is a pretty good working model. I know we use this on material design. I've used it for Symphony Cisco system. We're using it for Nova right now. I know GE's using this for their Predix system. But if you ever get into building a design system, this is a model you kind of want to think about. It's a way to kind of help scale this stuff. Okay. All right. There we go. So the next thing that I want to kind of cover with you guys after design systems, I think we are on to organizational design. So this is just starting to get to be a hot topic. Peter Merholtz and Kristen Skinner actually recently wrote a book about this, aptly named Org Design for Design Orgs. It's an O'Reilly book, a lot of really great material in there. And interestingly enough, a lot of the stuff that they actually talk about applies to not just design orgs. It can be, you take those models, those patterns they've thought about, and they can be applied to product marketing, sales, engineering. They look a lot at kind of structures, how to build teams, where teams live, how to scale teams. Michelle and I were having, I don't know if she's still in here or not. Yep, there she is. Yeah, so we were discussing this like last night, I think, right? Yeah. This really fascinates me. I'm a systems guy, so I look at everything as a system, right? So when I think about org design and how I'm trying to build and scale a team, this is like, near and dear to my heart. I've been really fortunate to have built and scaled teams from companies that are, I used to run a studio. I mean, like when I first met Kyle, I was running a studio back east. I am back east, what am I saying? Yeah. out east here. And I think we started like at 2 people, scaled up to around 25 or so. And then, I went to Twitter, and the team scaled from like 6 to 25 or 30. I went to Cisco, worked in teams that varied in size from like 2 to 25 to 60. And so I've gone through these cycles, and it's kind of refreshing reading Kristen and Peter's book, because a lot of stuff I've been through is in there. But one of the things that they kind of encourage when you're thinking about, all right, so we got design systems here. And when it comes to org design, right, thinking about how you build and scale teams. And there's kind of 3 general models that you use when you build and scale teams. And Michelle talked about this a little bit, kind of how they work at WeWork, right? So one is this notion of just what we call centralized team, right? It's literally just that. It's a centralized team. Your entire design team kind of sits together, stays together. They live together. They don't really spend a whole lot of time with other groups, other parties. This is typically pretty good for companies that are like, less than 50 people, right? You got a small team, maybe half a dozen people or so. It's more like an agency model, that kind of like, at the center of the hub. It can work well for keeping standards standardized and cohesive, ensuring quality across the board. But when you get into organizations where you have to, you start having, and also like if you only have one product, right? When you get in a case where you've got, I don't know, like 3+ products, this starts to break down really quickly because that centralized group becomes a bottleneck, right? So what do? Well, most companies go, well, we're going to go distribute it, right? And so I've been through all of these. And so, we got a team here, we got a team here, got a team here, team here, team here. Within each of these teams, we still end up with some visual design, interaction design, maybe prototyping, writing, or whatever. You'll find this in a couple different ways. One, if you have, when you end up with multiple products, right? Another one is multiple geographies, right? So as at Cisco, for example, my team was in 10 geographic locations around the world, 5 time zones, and it was described to me as we sat at the collision point of 72 products and services, right? And so I inherited a team that was mostly like this, and it looked like it was like this, because you saw the products coming out of the team. They all looked like they were kind of done in isolation from each other, right? And that's not anybody's fault. That's just like, that's the nature of this beast, right? It's one that companies tend to use when you have to go to scale for products or geographies, just because you have to get stuff out the door and you don't want engineers doing it, and so they kind of fall to this model. But again, it starts to break down as far as just cohesion, consistency, making them look like they came from the same family, right? It really starts to kind of fall apart. But you'll typically end up moving kind of towards this direction as the company gets to be a couple hundred or a couple thousand people, right? And so we've got centralized. Then you have, this is typically, often referred to as embedded or distributed. And then there's a third model, which is kind of a hybrid. Some people call it federated. I mean, there's a couple other terms. But essentially, what you do, this is actually what GE is doing right now, is you have kind of a center of excellence with these little pods you set up, right? And so the center of excellence here is usually like a core team, smaller number, and they're kind of the group that sets the standards, engages with these other teams, right? So it's not a one-way street. When you go to this model, it's very much a back and forth. So these guys might set the standards, but then when they get deployed out to the special forces team or the distributed team, these guys then take those standards, actually put them to use in the real world, right? Because this is all theoretical design at this point. They put it to use in the real world and see what breaks, right? So these guys will launch the reference designs. The pod teams take them, implement them, sometimes come back with proposals for variants, and then this team is kind of the team that goes through and makes sure that they're certified and kind of keeps it consistent, right? This model can scale really, really well. It's kind of the best of both worlds. It does add some overhead though, because you got to make sure this is coordinated. You got to have back and forth. You know, at Cisco, that having a team in 10 locations around the world, I mean, we were really blessed to have extreme, like the best video conferencing you can imagine. I mean, I had a 27-inch like high-def video screen that was only for video calls at my home office, right? Like that's the only thing it was used for. I think it was like $5,000, right? And it was literally just to communicate with somebody on the other side of the globe. So you know, but it does take some kind of additional technology and effort to make this thing work. So, you know, depending on the maturity level of where your org is and kind of your challenges, you know, you're going to want to kind of look at one of these 3 different models. This is kind of the penultimate to get to, but it requires a lot of support, a lot of funding. You know, you're looking at a team that's going to be like 40 to 60 plus, you know, which can be challenging if you're having budget discussions. So, but again, you gotta, you know, kind of try and either work through one of these. I think, you know, Michelle, like you guys are using something kind of like this, right? There's a somewhat centralized team, but you know, they have offices all around the globe, so they've got kind of like embedded people that are, think of these guys as like, they're the evangelists for what happens here, right? All right, so then the last piece I want to kind of talk about is design operations. And it's kind of like what it sounds. It's how do you operate, right? When I think about design operations, there's kind of key 3 things that come to mind. So one is your engagement model, right? Like how do you engage with others? How do they engage with you? Another is a team charter, and the third is a playbook. So starting off with the engagement model. One of the models I try and push for, I refer to as a 3-legged stool. You typically have product, eng, and design. And so from an operational model, what I try and push for is, you know, to me, this is a product team, right? Because you got to have all 3 of those to ship a product. You don't have a product manager, it's probably not going to go so well. You don't have engineering, probably going to build the thing. You don't have a designer. I mean, design's going to get done, but it's probably going to suck, right? So, but if you have this kind of 3-legged stool, you have all 3 of those pieces that are necessary for that product team to actually deliver something that's of value at high quality that can scale, right? And so this is kind of at the core of the operational model that I typically work towards. Now that ends up from design, there's kind of 2 levels. One is direct support, and other is what we call office hours. So I'm in a situation right now where our team is asked to support maybe 48 products. It's a really small team. We can really only support 3, right? And so what we do is we do direct support for these 3 products where we kind of engage in this model. You know, we do research, we do design, we do prototyping, we'll do validation, go through the full cycle. The other products, we can't do that. And so what we've done is we've built a design system that we call Nova. It's got a bunch of components in Sketch. It's actually in code. It's an NPM package, so any engineer can basically download the thing and start implementing it. You know, we've got some PMs that we've given access to Sketch. We do like a trial run, you know, a couple that we trust. You know, gave them access to Sketch. We'll sit in a room and kind of help them sketch out some ideas, and then they just basically take Sketch to render the pixels, right? And they come back to us for an office hour session and say, hey, this is what we talked about. This is what I kind of did. Like, you know, did I get it right? We're like, well, I mean, yeah, you did okay over here. We need, you know, this doesn't really kind of follow the guidelines and the patterns for this component, but here's how you fix it. And they're like, oh, great. So, and this has also worked with, we've got some that are operating overseas. And so we've got a PM that might be here in the States with an engineer and designer over in India. And so, you know, like once a week, we'll get on a video call for 45 minutes. And same thing, it's office hours, right? And so that's like, yeah, that's one way you can scale. Another thing that I found is really kind of key is establishing a team charter. I don't know anybody who does this better than Russ Unger. He's got a whole exercise around it. I think he teaches workshops on it. I'd encourage you guys to just go Google Russ Unger plus design charter. The model that he has, I don't know if he came up with it or he's just kind of like made it popular, but the model that he uses, I've used for a couple teams. But you can think of the team charter as like, why do we exist? You know, why would you as a PM or an engineer engage with me? What value do I bring to the business, right? That's one aspect of it. Another aspect of a team charter is kind of like how you want to be known, right? So in our team charter, we talk about how our purpose is to bring deep empathy and understanding about customers' motivators, pain points, and behaviors to the business, right? And we act as a partner with product and engineering to make that happen. But the last statement in our charter is one that our design team felt was paramount that they had to communicate. And that last statement says, we are problem solvers, not pixel pushers. Because I've worked in a number of environments where design is seen as just pushing some pixels, right? Which is why it was kind of a little dangerous for us and cautionary when we were deciding to kind of let some PMs have access to Sketch, because like we don't want to proliferate the idea that all we do is just push pixels, right? So, but that's kind of baked into the charter. So your charter is kind of, you know, it's there's an exercise again that Russ has kind of set up. It takes about an hour. You run the team through it, and then you have everybody on the team sign the thing, right? So not only did we build it together, but we are literally signing our names on the dotted line here. Right, you print it out, you hang up on the wall, you make it known and public. This past week, we had a product kickoff for the company that I work at, and I did about a 30-minute session on our team and some success stories. And the very first slide was our team charter, right? I wanted to come out of the gate and just say, hey, to the entire company that's mostly kind of sales and engineering driven, this is what your design team is for, right? And that very last statement on that screen was like, we're not pixel pushers. We solve problems, right? So we wanted to kind of lead with that because we want to set that expectation out of the gate. So the last thing I want to kind of touch on, and then we'll go to some kind of Q&A, is a playbook. Playbooks have a couple different definitions. When I think of a playbook, I think of a few things. And I mean, if you play sports, I mean, it's not much different than what you'd have with a sports team as a playbook, right? There are plays in there. So given a certain context, a certain challenge, what's the move you make? So for us, things that are in the playbook are different artifacts you might produce, different skill sets that you've got on the team, different exercises you might run. So we're early on. If we're early on in the stage of a life cycle of a product, one of those plays might be doing day in the life customer interviews or shadowing, right? And so you have literally a series of plays that are in that playbook that the team can kind of run through, and it's almost like a menu. So I can sit down with a PM and they can ask questions and like, oh, we need this stuff built. Like, okay, great. Let me pull the playbook out, right? And kind of like, here's how you engage with us and how we kind of run through this, right? We're going to do sprint 0. We're going to do some planning. We're going to kind of do some discovery work. We're going to kind of identify what the problem is. We'll write a brief, right? We'll do some validation. You're going to set some customers up for us to go interview, right? Hoorah! We're in this together, right? So that's how we kind of think of it. There's exercises. There's artifacts. You'll typically include some examples of artifacts. I don't know about you guys, but I've worked at a number of companies that thought they knew what a persona was until we deliver a persona, and they're like, oh. So it's not like sales guy, it's more like a role, like they create stuff. You're like, yeah, because that person you describe is in sales and in HR and in finance and in security and in facilities management. And the light bulb goes off and they're like, actually, yeah, wow, I never thought of it that way. Okay. So typically we'll include some artifacts, right? Because when people see things, it kind of like starts to bring the story home, right? And then another thing is principles. Our design system has principles, but our playbook also has principles. The principles in the playbook are a little different. Again, back to like legacy and leadership, I think about the principles that I want in that playbook are how I want this team to behave, how we want to behave. So whereas the principles in a design system might be something like cool and vibrant, bold yet humble, clarity, that type of thing, the principles in a playbook, at least in ours, are more things like respect, compassion, empathy, integrity, right? They are the things that as a team we want to subscribe to and we want to be known for. And we put those in the playbook so that all of our team is on the same page as far as how we operate, how we engage with other people, how they engage with us, what's expected of this team. And so when we bring new people on board, right, we make sure that they're We kind of check them against those principles. Like, do I think this person is going to operate with integrity? Are they going to add value to the team? Are they going to show compassion to other people around us? Are they going to operate from a place of empathy, right? And then it can even serve a purpose if you've got some people on your team maybe who are very challenging to deal with and, unfortunately might need to be managed out, right? You can kind of go through and say, well, hey, like this is how we operate. Unfortunately, I've had to do that in the past. Somebody, that maybe I've known for years and they just weren't operating by the playbook. We had a couple come to Jesus meetings and that didn't do the trick. And so finally it was like, look, it's pretty clear, in the playbook, this is how we operate. And, so this is, you might be really great at what you do, but you're just not going to be great on this team, right? So these are, again, design systems, org design, and operations. These are kind of, three things that I look at, when I'm kind of building and shaping and making teams and cultures and try and apply, again, that kind of rigor of craft and care to building these teams. A few years ago when I moved out to the Bay Area, I remember sitting down at dinner with some friends, and I'd run a studio for a while and kind of been in a leadership role, but this was at a company that was going to be pretty much just a leadership role, and I remember making the comment of, like, I've been there for 3 months, and I literally haven't done anything but open a web browser and mail and a calendar, And for those who don't know, I wrote the prototyping book for our field, so I'm a maker. Like, if you didn't get that, I make furniture. I've got a sizable garden. I make stuff. And I'll never forget, Erin Lehman, who's a friend of ours, she looked at me and she was like, so, like, you'll probably never open Sketch again? Or like write any code? And I was like, I might not, And she was like, that's like what? But you're a maker. Like, how you gonna deal with that? And I said, like my perspective has changed. Then before, my product was a product people interacted with. It was typically software of some sort. But now my product is this team, and I'm gonna use the same approach with this team that I do with any product, right? And when you move into leadership, like that's hopefully how you operate. No different than a product, like you assess where the product is. Maybe you have to redesign some stuff. Maybe you got to clean some stuff up, right? Maybe you got to go in and hire some new people, add some new features to that team, right? And so again, I'm kind of like, that's usually the space I think about is, for me in a leadership role, that team now is your product. And even again, if you're not a leadership, you can still operate from a leadership standpoint where you're still thinking about the others on your team that might just be, what's the term I'm looking for? Colleagues, right? And still, kind of take that same kind of care and compassion. All right, so wrapping things up. It's a fun little exercise that I've recently started with my team. And it gets actually to what I was talking about, like the assessment aspect. So one of the things that's important to understand when you're in leadership or when you're working with a team is like, what skills do we have, right? Where we have gaps. And so I had in the past kind of developed a template on paper that had, I think, maybe like 7 different facets that I would kind of grade people on, right? Some of them are pretty standard things like, research, interaction design, visual design, prototyping, motion design, and then some that are more softer skills like presentation skills. Like how are your presentation skills? Because you might be a really kick-ass visual designer, but if your presentation skills suck, I'm probably not going to let you present to the CEO, right? But if somebody else on the team can do it, that's all right, because we're kind of in this together. So I used to do this on paper, and about a year ago, I was sitting at the Enterprise UX conference with a couple guys, and we were talking about leadership and kind of like assessing teams and growing teams, and talked about this paper model. And I don't even know where this came from, but out of the blue, probably because I have kids, and we literally have like 1 million Legos in our house. My 7-year-old, since he's been six, has been building like the Lego sets meant for 8 to 12-year-olds. Like, he just finished the Millennium Falcon by himself, right? Like, Okay, he just finished the Millennium Falcon by him. He's 7 years old. It's like 1,200 pieces, right? It blows me away. So we've got like all these Legos strung around the house. And so I actually started thinking about, the downside of paper is I can't like layer them on top of each other to kind of see how they fit together, right? I can assess you as an individual, but I can't really kind of then mash you up with the rest of the team. And so this guy Casey and another friend of mine, Dave Gray, we were sitting around talking about is there a different way you could do this? And I was like, Legos. Like, what if you use Legos to do it? And they're like, what? I was like, oh, think about it. I think this could be something. If you give them Legos, and maybe it's a timed exercise, and this is what I do. It's a timed exercise of 90 seconds. There's like 7 different facets. Each Lego is a different color. You are allowed to pick anywhere from 0 to 5 of that color that aligns with a skill set. So purple might be visual design, magenta might be research, green might be storytelling, yellow might be presentation skills, brown might be motion design. And so you have these piles laid out in front of you. You're only allowed to pick up to 5, and 5 means like you're a Zen master, right? Like you can teach the shit, right? And if it's like 1, you're like, I'm interested, but like really not that great at it. And so what we've been doing is we set the piles out. It's time exercise, 90 seconds. You basically not just pick the Legos out, you have to pick the Legos out and build your shape, right? You're allowed to kind of build any way you want. So these are from some of the team I've got right now. And for me, what's fascinating about this is a couple things. One, look at the colors that are there. See which ones that we're kind of heavy on and which ones we're light on, because that starts to help me assess with the team, if they think that maybe we're really heavy on interaction design but too light on visual, right? And also, downside is, those who do research, this is self-assessment, right? So those of us who do research kind of start smiling and go, well, yeah. But here's what's really fascinating is the beauty of this is with self-assessment, to me, it's kind of highlighted the gap between what some people on the team think they have skills and what I think they have skills, right? Which is another insight from this. So this exercise is 3 parts. 1, they basically just build their own shape, and then they kind of show their shape to the team. We kind of get to look at each other and like, oh, that's kind of cool. Oh, I didn't know you had that skill set, right? Or that you thought you had that skill set. The next exercise is I pair 2 people together, and I tell them that they are not allowed to change the shape of their structure, but they have to put it together with another one and build a stable structure that won't fall over. Which, of course, look at these. You stick something together, there's holes, there's gaps. It's probably not going to be very stable. And through that exercise, what I'm trying to teach them is, like if Roger and I are working on something and I am just stuck to my guns and will not move and will not like give on anything, and I'm like, it's going to be my way, right? And Roger does the same thing, we're probably not going to pair well together. And we're probably not going to make a great team together. The third exercise is now you're going to be paired with that person again. You cannot add any new colors, right? We still want to have a max of 5, but now you're allowed to deconstruct your piece and with your partner reconstruct and kind of borrow and pillage together to build a structure that is stable and kind of has the proper mix of what we need for that product, right? And through that exercise, what I hope to teach them is, if I'm working with Roger, we're a little more flexible, and in some cases, maybe I'll let you own a little more of the visual design. In some cases, maybe I own a little bit more of it. In other cases, maybe, you're doing a little more of the research. In some cases, like I'm stepping in, but it's literally much more of a partnership approach that together we create a much stronger unit, right? It's been a fun little exercise. I think it's been helpful. I know it's been helpful for me. The team seems to like it. And then they get to keep the little Lego pieces afterwards, which is kind of cool. Because inevitably, like a new person comes in and they're like, what is that? And they're like, oh, let me tell you about my Lego piece. And they get all excited. So, okay. So I want to leave you with this question. I want you guys to just kind of ask yourself, what is your living legacy? What's the mark that you're going to be leaving behind on people in this world? In our industry, I've been in this industry for like 2+ decades, and I hope to God I've left some mark behind that like has helped somebody do something better than I ever did, right? So just kind of ask yourselves that question. That's my challenge to you. So thank you. I think I have some time for questions. I mean, unless I shouldn't. All right, cool. Anybody ask questions? Yes, what's your name? Dan, how you doing?
So the first half of this is a leading question, but
You're a researcher, Dan?
yeah.
All right, what do you got?
So do you think that design systems are, to some extent, doomed to fail because they don't really convey the principles that you need to really do design well, or to do the right thing in design? And second part is, do you think there are ways around that?
So for the first, I would say if they don't convey, then yes, they are doomed to fail. So ways around that, make them convey it. One of the things I push for when I'm working with teams to build design systems is I try to make it clear to them that we don't serve the system serves us. And this is why this model is really important, is because we may come up with like a really awesome date picker, and then we go to execute that date picker and find out that it does not work, and yet we still try and shove content into that date picker to make it work, right? And now it's failing us. Probably one of the best examples, when I was working on a system at Cisco, I'll use a simple one, right? A button. And I remember having a conversation with a front-end developer, and they're like, well, how high should the button be? And I said, well, I mean, the body font is 14. We're an 8-base system, so you've got a measure and a half above, measure and a half below, and so you're looking at probably like 40 pixels. But if I change the body size to 16, now that button needs to scale to like 44. It's inside out. He's like, no, but I need to fix like height. I'm like, that's not how this works, dude. It's inside out, not outside in, right? And so it literally had to like change their way of thinking of like, what's the size of the card? Well, the size of the card is driven by the content that it has to. I mean, this is standard like IA stuff, right? It's like, I mean, So if the system basically is designed so that you have to support it instead of it supporting you, it's gonna fail. If the system doesn't really embody the principles that you've set out, it's gonna fail. So normally before I even design a system, what I'll work on is we have a discussion around what's the personality we're trying to communicate with this system, right? Is it like bright and airy? Is it maybe crisp? Like a few kind of key phrases so we can all kind of align on what a direction should be. If you don't do that, you and I are going to debate that shade of green for like 45 minutes, and we're never going to come to a conclusion, right? So like the Nova system we're working on, like at its core, there's a really good story behind it. The company I work at, it's got a whole space theme, right? And so we want to stick with the space theme. I started kind of hunting around for images. I came across an exploding supernova star from NASA. I'm like, this is awesome. It's in the space theme. We can call it Nova. The color palette, which is actually extracted out of that exploded Nova photograph, is cool and vibrant. And so like the title slide is Nova, cool yet vibrant, bold yet humble. And it starts with but starting with those kind of ideals. Now we're debating the shade of green, and somebody comes to me with something that's like a brownish green. I'm like, yep, it's not cool yet vibrant, not bold yet humble, right? So it kind of takes me out of the mix. I actually learned, my kids are in Montessori school, so I actually kind of learned this technique from Montessori school. If you want the kids to go do something, you set a bell. When the bell goes off, Lou has to stop what he's doing. And instead of me being the bad guy, it's the bell that's the bad guy, right? You put it off on a third party, right? So it's a great kind of like direction technique. So those principles are really, really kind of key. So did that help? Yeah, okay. Anybody else? Yeah, what's your name? Abe. What's up?
So if you're an organization that's really heavily focused on product and engineering,
Yes.
how do you go about enacting a cultural change to help them focus a little more deeply on design?
Slow, steady. So here's the thing. I have only worked in organizations that are primarily driven from engineering or sales or project management. I had a conversation several years ago with a pretty close friend of mine who was working at a very large telecom company that was kind of engineering and sales driven. She'd been there for 9 months. And we went for coffee, and she's like, I mean, what am I supposed to do here? Like, I don't think I'm gonna have any impact, right? And I made a very blunt comment to her, which was, you have two choices. And most of these things are binary choices. You have two choices. You can either commit to sticking around for 18 months and see if there's been any change at all, right? Like you set 5 goals for yourself. So, like in your example, I'd start with a charter, I'd start with like a playbook, right? And you think about the 5 things that you and your team want to change in the next 6 months. And you kind of map out treat it like a design problem. Map out a path to kind of get there, work against it, and you might see traction on 1 in 6 months, okay? You write 6 more, or 5 more for the next 6 months. Write a plan, treat it like a product. Move against it, you've got to roadmap the whole entire thing, and at the end of those 6 months, you probably see some traction on maybe 2 of those things. You've not solved anything yet, right? By the time you hit the 3rd cycle, which is like the 18-month mark, you've probably actually knocked 1 or 2 of those things off your list and made some traction on one of the other ones. If you haven't, you need to quit that job and go work somewhere else. If you have, you stick around, and in 3 to 5 years, you will have changed that company. So I gave this advice to a friend of ours. Her name's Olivia Labate. She was at Comcast at the time. She was the only IA at Comcast. Olivia stuck around for 3 to 5 years. What happened? That team has that group has a team of like 40 or 50 designers now. And they got in a position where PMs and engineers were coming to them like lining up, right? But I was like, Olivia, you got a choice. Today, you either go home and you quit that job at Comcast, or you stick it out for the next 18 months. If you can't commit to the next 18 months, you need to get the hell out of there. Like, it's in a large company like that, it's the only way to do it. And some people don't want to commit to